Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shekalim Daf Yud Beis begins with a Mishnah, lengthy Mishnah, discussing the halachas about what happens when somebody's makdish his property, and that property contains a mixture of items, some of which are befitting for different services in the Beis HaMikdash. What do we assume his intent was, and what do we do with them? The Gemara will quote a number of machloksin, the Mishnah will quote a number of machloksin, and the Gemara will analyze them one by one. So, when somebody's makdish his property, he donates it to the Beis HaMikdash, or he sets it aside for Kaddish reasons and functions. There are a number of different levels of Kedusha that they could achieve. Something could have Kedushas Haguf, which means it itself is Kadosh, it's holy. If it's fitting to go on the Mizbeach, it actually could be brought on the Mizbeach itself. Something could have Kedushas Haguf, but not be fitting to go on the Mizbeach, not the kind of thing that could go on the Mizbeach itself. And it could be something which has Kedushas Haguf, and it could go on the Mizbeach, but it could only go for Korban Tzibur, the type of thing that only the Tzibur could bring, not the individual. Then there's something else called Kedushas Hadamim, where the object has Kedusha in its value, but it itself can't go on the Mizbeach at all. And a type of that is Kedusha's Bedek Habayis, where it's specifically set aside for a fund that Hektish should use for the maintenance of the Beis HaMikdash, the maintenance fund, and generally Hektish will sell it and use the money to pay workers or something like that for the Beis HaMikdash. Now, of course, anything which Hektish will sell has to go to Chulin, has to have its Kedusha transferred onto something else. And you cannot transfer Kedusha onto something which already has Kedusha. So here we have a situation where somebody was makdish it, and then he's makdish all his property at once. So we look at the property that he has a couple of things there, a couple of things that fall into different categories. So the Mishnah discusses three cases. The first case is where among his property, most of which is only fitting for Bedek Habayis, only befitting to go on the maintenance fund, it cannot go on the Mizbeach. In there he has some things which could go for Karbonos Tzibur. And the Gemara explains that this is referring to Ketores. He has Ketores there. Now the problem is, what are we going to do with this Ketores? So just put it on the Mizbech and use it as Ketores we can't do, because it was given by one individual. It has to be purchased with a Machzis HaShekel, with a Karbanos Tzibur. Now, to actually buy it now from Hektish's maintenance fund, with Hektish's Karbanos Tzibur fund, with Hektish's Machzis HaShekel fund, you can't do that, because you cannot buy Kedusha with Kedusha. You cannot transfer the Kedusha of the Machzis HaShekel onto these items that already have Kedusha's Bedek Habayis. So what are we supposed to do with this thing? And we can't sell it generally and just sell it to an individual, because you cannot be Makdish, you cannot send to Chulin something which has Hektish for no reason, something which is befitting to go on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says we have to transfer its Kedusha off it somehow and repurchase it with the Machzis HaShekel Korban Tzibur fund. How are we going to do that? So this is a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva says you find workers that you need to pay, and you give it to them in exchange for their work. It becomes their salary. The Kedusha of these Ketores transfers onto the non-existent work that they did. It's not a physical object, but it's an obligation, and it transfers onto that. That is already belongs to Hektish, because they already worked for Hektish, and they'll take this thing and it'll go to Chulin. Benazi says you can't transfer onto something which doesn't exist. It has to be an actual object. So therefore what you have to do is you have to take money, which is set aside to pay the workers, transfer the Kedusha from these Ketores onto that money. Then you give the Ketores, which are now Chulin, to these workers. The workers will then have Chulin Ketores. They have nothing to do with it. You'll buy it back from them with the Machzis HaShekel fund, and now it'll be regular Karbonos Tzibur Machzis HaShekel fund, and then that is a fine use for it. Okay. Next, the Gemara discusses what happens. The Mishnah discusses what happens if you looked at the property that this person was makdish, and you had regular things which can't go on the Mizbeach, but you also had animals that could go on the Mizbeach for actual Karbonos. So the question is, what did the man intend? So Rabbi Eliezer says everything that he was makdish for one purpose. He didn't want to split the functions of them. So if some of the objects here were not befitting to go on the Mizbeach, he wasn't makdish any of it to go on the Mizbeach. It was the same Kedusha for all of them. Therefore, it all got Kedusha's Bedek Habayis. It all got the Kedusha of its value just to go to Hektish's maintenance fund. So now you have animals. So what are you supposed to do with these animals? So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says that you should sell the animals. Now the animals get kedushas haguf because they are fitting to go on them. Well, they have kedushas bedek habayis because that's what he intended to put on it. And by the way, it's an isser d'oraisa to be makdish animals that could go on the mizbeach with kedushas bedek habayis. If they could go on the mizbeach, they should go on the mizbeach. But you want these animals to go on the mizbeach eventually, and this guy was makdish with kedushas bedek habayis. So what are you supposed to do with it? So he says you're going to do as follows: you're going to sell them to somebody who's going to use them as karbanos. So if there are males there, you'll sell them to people who need to bring a karban ola because a karban ola has to be male. If there are females, you'll sell them to somebody who needs to bring a karban shlamim because shlamim have to be female. And then the kedusha will transfer onto the money. The bedek habayis kedusha will transfer off the animals onto the money. You use that money for regular bedek habayis expenses, regular maintenance expenses, like everything else was makdish. And the person who buys it will be makdish it separately. He will take it and he'll be makdish it to use as a carbon, because when he receives it, it's chulin. He'll be makdish to use as a carbon, and then it'll get kedushas haguf, and it'll be brought as a carbon, no problem. That is Rabbi Eliezer's approach. It's built on the fact that he assumes that all of these animals got kedushas bedek habayis. Now Rabbi Yeshua says no. The guy who was makdish had different intents of what type of kedusha. The objects in his possession that he was makdish that can't go on the mizbech, he was makdish to be regular bedek habayis. But these animals he wanted to go to the highest level of kedusha that's possible. Therefore, the karban olos, the male animals, could go as a karban ola. They go straight on the mizbeach, karban ola. That's what he was makdish it for. The females can't go as a karban ola, but we assume he wanted it to go as a karban ola. So therefore, what we say is that we should sell it. Should sell these animals to somebody who's going to use them for a karban shlamim. Again, they're females; they have to be used as a shlamim. So we sell them to somebody who's going to use them as a shlamim. But we take the money that now has the kedusha of ola that the man who was makdish originally put on these animals has kedusha ola. We take that money, we buy karbanos ola with it. Okay, Rabbi Kiva says I like Rabbi Eliezer's pshat better because it's consistent. It shows that he had the same hekdesh on all of them. We don't split the hekdeshos. This one's ola, this one's shlamim, this one's maintenance. We don't have that. The Mishnah now says that Rav Papias says, I see each of their opinions in different situations. Depends what the man specified when he was makdish. If he just said, I makdish all my things without specifying anything, so then he didn't really have an opportunity to specify what's for what, that they should have different kedushas. He didn't itemize his hekdesh. Since he didn't itemize, he couldn't specify, but we can understand, like Rabbi Yeshua, that he wanted different hekdeshas for different things. He wanted them each to go to their highest possible level. However, if he itemized, and he said, I'm being makdish my cow, and I'm being makdish my sheep, and I'm being makdish my other things, then he had an opportunity to itemize if they had different types of hekdesh that he wanted, because he mentioned them differently. If he didn't specify what's for what, then you assume he wanted them all to be the same, and I hear Rabbi Eliezer's approach. Okay, now the Mishnah moves to the third case, which is he was makdish all his possessions, and in there you found wine, flour, and oil, things which could go on the mizbeach, wine, flour, and birds, things which could go on the mizbeach, wine, oil, and birds, things which could go on the mizbeach as karbanos, karbanos mincha, and even karban ola. So here, Rabbi Eliezer says differently, and therefore some Rishonim explain this to be Rabbi Elazar, because it's a different approach. He says you sell them all to somebody who's going to use them as a proper carbon that they could be used for, and you use the money to buy karbanos ola. Very similar to what Rabbi Yeshua said before, that you assume that they wanted to be used for a karban ola, and you use the money for a karban ola, and they themselves are used for the karbanos that they are befitting for. Okay, the Gemara now says, what did we mean when we said that we found other things? He was makdish his possessions, we found things that are befitting to be used as karbanos tzibor. What is that? So Rabbi Yechon, like we said, says that that's ketores. Rabbi Shai says, how does a person come to have a ketores? It's referring to the family of Beis of Tinnis, who they used to know how to make ketores, and they would receive ketores as their payment for their work that they did. Generally, hekdesh would buy it back from them with machzis shekel money, but if they were makdish before they bought it back, then that's how they had it, and that's how you could have such a situation. The Gemara explains what is the machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and Ben Azai, whether you have to first transfer the kedusha onto other money. So Gemara says machlokes is, could you be mechalel kedusha? Could you transfer kedusha onto malacha, onto work, which is not a physical object? Okay, now the Gemara quotes a Mishnah Maseches Tzmura. The Gemara wants to say which Tana it goes like. The Mishnah identifies 4 ways in which the kedusha of the maintenance fund, bedek habayis, is actually stricter than the other kedushas, has certain special halachos. First of all, the Gemara says anyone who's makdish things stam without specifying, it goes to bedek habayis, goes to the maintenance fund. Next thing is that anything can be makdish for kedushas bedek habayis, as opposed to the mizbeach that can only have things which are fitting to go in the mizbeach, like animals. But any object can receive kedushas bedek habayis. Next, something which is kedushas bedek habayis that produces other things, like eggs or children or milk, that also gets kedushas bedek habayis, as opposed to kedushas mizbeach that does not fall on anything which comes out of something which has kedushas mizbeach. And the fourth thing the Mishnah says is that the Kohanim don't really get anything out of kedushas bedek habayis. It's all used for for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. On the other hand, kedushas mizbeach, Kohanim do get some parts from, they eat some parts of some korbanos, and they get the skin of other parts of other korbanos. Okay, now this Mishnah the Gemara says has to be Rabbi Eliezer, because it says that somebody who's makdishes things without specifying goes for kedushas bedek habayis. It goes for the maintenance fund. That is not true according to Rabbi Yeshua, that there are situations in which it goes automatically for kedushas carbon. So it's got to be Rabbi Eliezer's sheet over here, this Mishnah. All right, now the Gemara explains what is Rabbi Eliezer's source. So the Gemara says he learns it from a pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ishki akdish es beisai." Somebody who's makdish his house, kodesh l'Hashem, becomes kodesh l'Hashem. The Gemara says it can't be that he's makdish his actual house, because that's discussed in a different pasuk that says, "V'ma makdish yigal es beisai." So what does it mean when it says makdish his house? It means he's makdish his estate, all his property. And what happens with it? It becomes kodesh l'Hashem. It becomes a type of kedusha which goes all to Hashem, not to kahanim at all, not to mizbeach. It goes all to Hashem. This teaches that if somebody's makdish his estate without specifying, everything goes for kedushas bedek habayis. Everything goes for kedushas Hashem, even things which are fitting for the mizbeach. The Gemara now discusses what situation exactly is machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua as to whether or not when a person is makdish his animals, do they get kedushas bedek habayis, maintenance fund, and do they get kedushas mizbeach to go on the mizbeach? So the Gemara has a three-way machlokas on what the situation is. According to Rabbi Zeira, the only case where there is a machlokas is where he's makdish the animals together with other things that have to go to kedushas bedek habayis. That Rabbi Eliezer says, since the other things are going to kedushas bedek habayis maintenance fund, the animals are also going to that. However, if he's makdish just animals, there's be no reason to say that they go to kedushas bedek habayis. Of course, they go to kedushas mizbeach like they're supposed to. Gemara says that Rabbi Ba, however, disagrees. He says no, it's the opposite. The only machlokes is where he's makdish just animals. If he's makdish other possessions together with animals, there even Rabbi Yeshua will agree that it all goes for kedushas bedek habayis. The machlokes is in the case where he's makdish only animals. So Gemara says makdish only animals. Why in the world would Rabbi Eliezer say it's kedushas bedek habayis? Gemara says because why didn't he say kedushas mizbeach? The normal thing to do is to be makdish your animals and say it's for the mizbeach. The fact that he says it and he says he's makdish it, it doesn't say for what, indicates there's something funny here, that he wants it to go for only kedushas bedek habayis. Rabbi Yechanan says that there's no difference. The machlokas is in both cases, and the Rishonim discuss how to learn it. It could be that they argue about both things. Is there an indication from the fact that the guy didn't say what it's for, that it must be for kedushas mizbeach, whether it's just animals, or even if it is animals together with other things? Both of these svaras are up to dispute. Rabbi Eliezer could say it's always can be kedushas bedek habayis, even if it's just animals. He didn't say anything. And Rabbi Yeshua will say it's always kedushas mizbeach, even if it's together with other things. Now, we have seen that although you're not supposed to be makdish animals to be used for the maintenance fund for kache bedek habayis, you are supposed to be makdish them as karbonos. But if you do go ahead and be makdish them as bedek habayis, they do have to be used for karbonos eventually. And the way to do that is to be paid to them, to redeem them, transfer their kedusha onto money, have them go to chulin. And then the buyer goes and he is re-makdish it as kache mizbeach, and he brings it as a carbon. Now the Gemara says that when it is redeemed, in the in-between stage, when it's redeemed, it goes completely to chulin. It doesn't retain any kedusha at all. And the proof of that is that there's a mission that says that if it gives birth, or you take milk from it at that point, that milk is mutter, you're allowed to use it for whatever you want. So from there you see that it's completely chulin. So the Gemara says not necessarily. That mission that says that is talking about where it was redeemed, and it got a mum. Once it has a mum, it can't go on the mizbech anymore. That's why it's completely chulin. But in your case, where you're just in the middle of transferring it from kache bedek habayis to kache mizbech by first redeeming it so that its kedusha goes off, it could be that it still retains residual kedusha even in its in-between stage. The Gemara says, I'm going to prove it to you, because there's a Mishnah that lists the differences between kache mizbech and kache bedek habayis. And one of the things that it says is that kache mizbech, its children and its milk, is usher after it's redeemed. And that has to be talking about where there was a mum. If there's no mum, then the whole discussion doesn't apply. So, therefore, when it says that that's the difference between kache mizbeach and kache bedek habayis, that kache mizbeach, the milk and the children are usher when it's redeemed, and kache bedek habayis, the milk and the children are mutter, it's obviously talking about where it got a mum. So, right, because it's comparing the two, and just like kache mizbeach, in that comparison is with a mum, kache bedek habayis is also with a mum. So therefore, you have no proof, again, that when you redeem it on its way to becoming re-makdish for the mizbeach, that it goes to chul. And it could be that it just gets a lowered kedusha, but it still has enough kedusha that its milk and children should be aser. So the Gemara says no, it's not correct, because if it's still at kedusha, you couldn't be makdish it again. Halachas kedusha doesn't chal on kedusha. You can only be makdish something that's totally chulin. So it's got to be that it goes completely to chulin, and then the owner who bought it can re-makdish it for the mizbech, but he can't say that it still retains kedusha. Then he wouldn't be able to be makdish it again. The Gemara now quotes a brisa, which will ultimately relate to our Mishnah. The brisa says, what happens if somebody's makdish a female animal, in a keva, to be a carbon oila or pesach or asham? Now, an oila, pesach, or an asham cannot come from a nekeva. It can't be a female, they have to be a male. So what happens? So it's the wrong animal. So the Gemara says there's a three-way machlokes on what to do. The Tanna Kama says it has kedushas haguf. Even though you can't bring it as a carbon, it has kedushas haguf. And, for example, if you were to try to do Tmura, try to switch its Kedusha onto a different animal, it would work that other animal would get Kedusha, because it has Kedusha's Guf. It has an innate Kedusha. Rabbi Shimon says only the animal, the Nekeva that's Mukdash to be an Oila, has Kedusha's Guf. The Gemara will explain why. The Pesach and Asham do not. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, so we have a machlokes what Rabbi Shimon said. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, also a Tana, said in the name of Rabbi Shimon, none of them get Kedushas HaGuf, and none of them could make another animal be Tmura, because they don't have Kedushas Guf. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says three things about this brisa. The first thing he says is, what's Rabbi Shimon's reasoning? Rabbi Shimon, according to the way he was first explained, said that only the oil gets kedushas haguf. Rabbi Yochanan explains because there's such a thing as a female carbon oila. How is that? A bird. It could be an oila sa'if. That could be a female. An oila's behema can't be a female. Therefore, since the concept of a female carbon does exist by an oila, if an animal is brought, a female animal is mukdash to be a carbon oila, it gets kedushas haguf, although you can't actually put it on the mizbech itself. The other two, Pesach and Asham, can't be a bird, and therefore there is no possible situation, there is no application at all of these types of karbanas to a female. Okay, now what's Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda's reasoning? So Rabbi Yochanan explains that as well, and he says, because you see that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda was explaining Rabbi Shimon. You see that Rabbi Shimon holds that even if one tiny bit is off, there's no Kedushas HaGuf. If it's a wrong gender of animals, certainly no Kedushas HaGuf at all. Where do you see the one tiny thing is off? Because Rabbi Shimon holds that if somebody has to bring a carbon Asham, and Asham is sometimes supposed to be a year old, and sometimes supposed to be 2 years old, meaning under a year or more than a year. Rabbi Shimon holds if it's the wrong one, the Mehemah doesn't get Kedusha at all. There's a Tanna Kama who argues on him, holds that he gets Kedusha, and he can be Makravit, but it won't work. It will not absolve the owner of the Chiyuv that he had. But Rabbi Shimon holds that it doesn't get Kedusha at all. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, look, if it's missing one detail, it's the wrong age, it doesn't get Kedusha Haguf. Certainly, if it's the wrong min, wrong type of animal altogether, it's supposed to be a male, instead it's a female, it certainly doesn't get Kedusha Haguf. Now, third observation Rabbi Yochanan has on this brisa is that the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as explained by Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, that none of these get Kedusha Haguf, is also the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah had said that if somebody's makdish a female as a carbon ola, it has to be redeemed and use the money as a carbon ola. Now, from the fact that he says that it can be redeemed and then you can use the money for a carbon ola, shows that it doesn't have Kedushas Haguf. Because if it had Kedushas Haguf, you couldn't redeem it. Halacha, something with Kedushas Haguf can't be redeemed. You have to first let it graze until it gets a mum. Only once it gets a mum could you then say that the Kedushas Haguf comes off and you could redeem it. So obviously Rabbi Shua holds, like Rabbi Shimon, according to the explanation of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, that a female who's mukdash, even for an ola, does not get Kedushas Haguf at all. The Gemara now brings the rest of the brisa. The rest of the brisa is that Rabbi gets involved, and he says, I don't like Rabbi Shimon's psak about the carbon Pesach. Rabbi Shimon has said that the carbon Pesach doesn't get Kedushas Haguf when it's a female. So says Rabbi, I don't agree with that. I think that it should. Why? Because the carbon Pesach that's never going to be used turns into a shlamim. A shlamim could be a female. So therefore, Korban Pesach does have a little bit of a connection to being brought on the Mizbeach if it's a female, and therefore this should also get Kedushas HaGuf as a female. Now, you'll never actually be able to be makar it as a female, because it's not going to be a kosher shlomim, because it comes from a Korban Pesach, which is puzzle, because it's a female. But it still has Kedushas HaGuf. Now, the Gemara asks, well, if that's true, so then Rebbe should also argue on an asham, because an asham that's not brought as a carbon becomes an ayla. And an ayla, Rabbi Shimon said, you could get Kedushas HaGuf if you're makdish it as a female, right? That was the one that Rabbi Shimon, even according to the Tanakhama, Rabbi Shimon did agree, and he said that an ayla could be a female because an ayla could be brought as a bird. So it has connections to being on the Mizbeach if it's a female. So therefore, an asham which turns into an ayla, if it's not brought, should also have a bit of a connection. You should also be able to say that an asham has Kedushas HaGuf if it's a female. So the Gemara says, no. No, it's not how it works. When a Pesach becomes a Shlomim, normally a kosher Pesach that's not used becomes a kosher Shlomim. It itself goes in the Mizbeach as a Shlomim. That's a close connection to being brought as a female if it's a Shlomim. When a carbon asham becomes a carbon ayla, it itself doesn't be brought on the Mizbeach as a carbon ayla. You sell it, you transfer its kedusha to money after it gets a mum, and you use the money to buy a different carbon ayla. It itself is never brought as an ayla, so it never really has a connection to being brought on the Mizbeach as a female. Therefore, you cannot use it. So now, the Gemara says, what is actually the machlokes between Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon? Why does Rabbi Shimon disagree with this? Why does he not feel that the fact that a carbon Pesach could turn into a Shlomim means he could bring it? So Gemara says, because he says that this carbon will never be brought as a Shlomim. This carbon has Kedushas HaDomim. It never go on the Mizbeach as a Shlomim, and therefore it has no connection. Rabbi, however, says, no, it does have a connection. It could have a Kedushas HaGuf, even though it itself cannot go on the Mizbeach, because it can be brought as a Shlomim if it would have been a kosher carbon Pesach. Okay, the Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah where we had seen the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua that somebody who's makdish his property and there are animals in there, whatever could be an ayla becomes an ayla. We assume that the guy wanted it to be an ayla. So if it's a zachar, if it's a male, it's brought on the Mizbeach as an ayla. If it's a female, you redeem it, you take the money and you buy an ayla. So Gemara says, what's the source for that? So Rish Lakish says it's as follows. It's from a pasuk in Vayikra that says, Dabra el Aaron vel bano vel kol bnei Yisrael v'yamar telehim ish ish mi beis Yisrael, any man from Klal Yisrael, asher Yaakov l'chol nidreim l'chol nidvaisam asher Yaakrivu l'Hashem, brings any carbonais, any promises, any donations, it should be l'Hashem, l'ayla, it should be an ayla. So the pasuk clearly says any donation which you can't define, you assume is an ayla. So now the Gemara says, now that only refers to a zachar, because it says l'retzonchem tamim l'zachar, is what it says further. That it should be it should be an unblemished without a mum zachar. So says, how do you know it applies to a female also, that we assume that it's an ayla and the guy wants you to sell it and make it into an ayla, use the money to buy an ayla. So it says, because the next word is babakar, and it says babakar b'ksavim v'izim. So the word babakar is a general term that seems to include all types of animals, all types of cattle. So you see, even for a female. So Gemara says, if that's true, so you should say the same thing, even if the animal's a balmum. You should sell it and use the animal to buy a carbon ayla, even if it has a mum. How come the halacha by a balmum, if he's makdish balmum, is not that way? Balmum, we say, just go straight to the Bedek Abayis fund, the maintenance fund. Why don't you say that the same way the word babakar includes all types of animals, even a female, it should include all types of animals, even a balmum? Yeah, I understand the pasuk says, tomim zachar. It's only referring to where it's not a balmum, where it's complete, where it's whole. But you're including from the word babakar all other types of things, so include that also. What's the difference between including a female and including a balmum? So Gemara says there's a very big difference. The difference is as wide as if you separate it with a weaving stick. The difference is that the word babakar refers to all types of animals. That means normal animals, healthy animals, male and female. It doesn't mean an animal which has a...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.